Huge crowds come out in support of both candidates less than a week before Venezuela's presidential election. But just what's at stake for the country? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. The streets of Venezuela's cities have been packed as rival presidential candidates hold some of their final rallies before Sunday's election. Having battled cancer for much of the last year, President Hugo Chavez is hoping to win another term in office. He's led the country since 1999. If he succeeds, he's promised to expand his socialist programs further, which are mainly focused on Venezuela's poor. His opponent, the 40-year-old Henrique Capriles, however, says that Chavez's policies have left the country with a multitude of problems. He's pledged the country will be more pro-business under his leadership. A major campaign issue is violent crime. 3 Capriles supporters were shot dead on Sunday, and the opposition candidate has regularly blamed Chavez for the high murder rate in the country. Most opinion polls, though, predict a comfortable win for President Chavez. However, some do predict a close race or put Capriles in the lead. What is certain is that both candidates offer differing visions for their country. Capriles wants to realign foreign policy back towards the positions of the US. He's also critical of Chavez using Venezuela's huge oil reserves to help some of his Latin American neighbors. Our Latin America editor, Lucia Newman, reports.
This neighborhood in Managua is named after Hugo Chavez, the president of a country more than 2,000 kilometers away. So far, yet so close to many Nicaraguans' hearts. Just ask these third graders who paid for their school. Nearby is a brand new health center, also courtesy of the Venezuelan leader. Chavez also paid for the neighborhood to get potable water, and very soon it's hoped a sewerage system.
He has been a great help. We only hope that Chavez remains in power so that we can have a better future.
Central America's poorest nation receives more than $500 million a year in gifts, long-term loans, and cut-rate oil from Venezuela. It has boosted economic growth and the popularity of Chavez's like-minded Nicaraguan counterpart, Daniel Ortega. Bolivia's left-wing president also bankrolls many of his social programs with Venezuela's support. Yet no country is as dependent on Chavez's generosity as is Cuba, which receives more than 100,000 barrels of oil a day. Recently retired Dr. Pablo Pastor, who uses his car as a taxi to make ends meet, fills his tank with certain apprehension.
We depend on Venezuela to supply our petrol, and if for any reason there is a problem with that country and we stop receiving our quota, I don't know what would happen to us.
What he means is that if President Chavez were to lose Sunday's elections, the communist island would certainly be plunged into an even more severe economic crisis. Opposition candidate Henrique Capriles vows that if elected, not a single drop of Venezuelan oil will be given away or undersold. He, along with many Venezuelans, argue that this country has too many pressing needs of its own to give away so much in the name of solidarity with regional left-wing governments.
We are in no position to sacrifice $7 billion, which is more than all the help that the European Union and the United States combined give to Latin America.
Good reason for governments whose annual budgets actually factor in aid from Venezuela to be biting their nails when Venezuelans go to the polls on Sunday. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera, Caracas.
So what's at stake in Venezuela's election? With me to discuss this, Mark Weisbrot, co-director of the Center for Economic Policy Research here in Washington, D.C. From New York, Nicholas Kozlov, author of Hugo Chavez, Oil, Politics, and the Challenge to the U.S. And from St. Louis, Missouri, Daniel Hellinger, author and professor of political science at Webster University. Let's begin with the first polls then. The poll by GIST21, which is run by a former interior minister under Chavez, gives the president a 13-point lead over Capriles. Another firm, Data Analysis, gives Chavez a 10-point lead, and a poll by Consultores is actually vastly different. It gives Capriles a 4-point lead over Chavez. Professor Hellinger, how do we make sense of all these different polls?
Well, for me, I would put the most stock in the data analysis poll. It's run by a commercial firm that has a lot of clients in Venezuela outside of politics. Its owner is someone from the opposition, and it has a long history of doing analysis. But the polls, it's a highly polarized situation. Even data analysis shows Capriles having closed the ground somewhat. And so I would say Chavez is probably ahead, and I would go mostly with the data analysis.
Mark Weisbrod, I mean, you think it's partly about just taking stock of long-term averages? How do you look at this?
Well, I mean, you know, there was one just a few weeks ago, the Bank of America did an adjustment of all the polls by their past bias, and they came out with a over 15-point lead for Chavez. Now,
and that's Bank of America, presumably no friend of Chavez.
No, not at all. And now the race has narrowed a little bit. At that time, data analysis was putting Chavez ahead about 14. So he's probably got a double-digit lead, but it is hard to tell because a lot of these polling firms, almost all of them have had some major screw-ups in the past.
All right. Well, in that case, let's just move straight on to Henrique Capriles, the man, and what he stands for. Let's just remind ourselves, he's 40 years old. He's the presidential candidate for the Democratic Unity Coalition, or Round Table, the MUD in Spanish. It's made up of parties and groups from across Venezuela's opposition. In 2008, he was elected governor of Miranda, Venezuela's second most populous state. He used his record of opening new schools while governor to highlight his main campaign issue of education. He says he won't immediately undo hundreds of nationalizations of companies and projects that were carried out under Chavez's presidency, though he is opposed to nationalizing more companies. However, what purported to be a Democratic Unity Coalition document was leaked to the Venezuelan media. That suggested Capriles actually wants to embrace a neoliberal agenda, but Capriles says those documents are forgeries. We'll get into that scandal in a bit more detail in a moment. But Nicholas Kozlov, as far as we can tell, is he managing to appeal beyond the wealthier minority who've always hated Chavez, frankly?
Well, I think he's been able to appeal to some disaffected Chavez voters. I think he's trying to sell himself as a social moderate and following the Brazilian model. But if these documents are true, and amazingly, we don't really know 1 week before the election whether Capriles is a neoliberal, a very right-wing, following a very right-wing economic philosophy.
What specifically did it say in the memo, Nicholas?
Brazilian. Well, the memo says that he would deregulate the banking sector, cut back on social spending, cut back on the communal councils, and cut back on the mercals, the government marketplaces which sell products at a discount to the poor. If that's true, then amazingly, 1 week before the election, we don't really know whether Capriles is a extreme right-wing conservative or following the Brazilian model of social development. And that is rather breathtaking for where we stand right now, 1 week before the election.
Professor Hellinger, I think it's interesting that even before this memo, former President Lula of Brazil, who, obviously is the model that everyone cites, he said a victory for Chavez is not just a victory for the people of Venezuela, but also a victory for the people of Latin America. This victory will strike another blow versus American imperialism. So, the purported model for Capriles wasn't convinced in the first place. But what should we make of this memo?
Well, I think I wouldn't make too much nor too little of it. I think the memo does reveal in general where the coalition that backs Capriles wants to go. But Venezuela is an oil country. The government has an enormous influence over the economy, and I think it will no matter who gets elected. The big difference, I think, is even if Capriles goes ahead and governs more as a social democrat, he'll try to take programs, the so-called missions, that are also involving participation, a kind of 21st century socialism, and probably try to make them more kind of the standard issue Western social welfare programs, probably with some cuts in them. But I don't think in any case that Capriles would end up being a neoliberal in the mold of some of the extreme laissez-faire governments we've seen in the past in Latin America.
But what do you, he presents himself, though, as a center-left politician. Would you put him in that mold, though?
No, I would call him a center-right politician, but I have to admit that he's been smart enough to recognize that to win an election in Venezuela, you cannot run on a right-wing platform. And I think he would try not to govern from the right. I think he would try to be a centrist. But what he tries to do and what his coalition, which includes some very right-wing elements, would let him do are two different things.
I suppose we should remember that this alleged paper was actually leaked by the coalition. Nicholas, I mean, how strong is this coalition? Is it simply based around opposition to Chavez? Even if they did get into power, how stable would it be?
Well, I think this reveals a lot of political fissures within the opposition camp. And in the aftermath of, after they disclosed these documents, three parties just plain out stated that we don't want any part in the Capriles campaign. There was another opposition politician who said that he didn't want to participate anymore, and very promptly after that he was fired. So I think this has revealed some fissures, and I think, as was stated previously, it whatever the shortcomings of the Chavez government, I've been critical at times, but I think psychologically the Venezuelan people are just not going back to the neoliberal programs. And so if Capriles really has this stealth program like Romney or something, or some far-right agenda, then he'd be right to conceal that, because I just don't think the Venezuelan people are willing to go back to the Caracazo riots of 1989, fighting austerity. I don't think austerity is particularly popular, whether it's in Spain, Greece, the United States, or Venezuela. So if there is a stealth program, then he'd be right to conceal it, because that just does not go over very well politically in Venezuela.
Okay, Mark Weiser, one area though that we are relatively sure about Capriles' agenda is on how to use oil revenues and the potential regional impact of the difference in his position. Lucia Newman, our Latin America editor, touched on some of those issues a moment ago. They would make have an enormous impact, wouldn't it, regionally?
What?
If Capriles was to win?
Well, yeah, I think it would have some impact, as your introduction showed. I don't agree that it's just a big giveaway. I mean, first of all, Cuba has sent thousands of doctors to Venezuela and helped them an enormous amount. And so it isn't just a one-way agreement between Venezuela and Cuba. And I think Venezuela has also been building allies in the region. When they loaned over around $6 billion to Argentina so they could get rid of the IMF for good a few years ago, that was important, and they have allies. And that's why, I mean, it's not like he's just giving money away. He's also building relationships, and those are very important, because the United States has been trying to get rid of this government for more than a decade. So he really needs to have these kinds of alliances in the region. And the other governments as well have a similar vision of Latin American integration, of making South America more independent. And so it's really a common plan, I think, among all the progressive governments. That's why you have that quote that you got from Lula, but they all feel the same way. And there's an attempt here to make Chavez look like he's somehow from outer space and different from all the others. But in fact, if you look at all the other left-of-center governments, including Brazil and Argentina, and also Bolivia and Ecuador and Uruguay, they really have a common program, and they all cooperate together, and they've made enormous progress since they became independent of the United States.
And of course, it's not just left-of-center governments. Professor Hellinger, I mean, President Chavez and Juan Manuel Santos of Colombia seem pretty chummy as well. I mean, as you look at regional leadership issues and getting out of the U.S., completely out of the shadow of the U.S., I mean, is Chavez integral to that, or is that's got its own momentum, which can't necessarily be stopped?
Well, it probably slows some momentum. I mean, Chavez deserves some credit, I think, for being a leader on Latin American integration. On the other hand, it's much larger than Chavez. And as you were saying, even Santos, who's a conservative in Colombia, recognizes that he needs that kind of cooperation with the rest of Latin America can reduce the influence of the United States in his own country. I'd also add that some of these oil programs, they support very poor countries in the Caribbean. They support countries where Venezuela has traditionally, through its diplomacy, wanted to have influence. In fact, back in the days of the first government of Carlos Andres Perez, during the big boom of the 1970s, Venezuela also was involved in oil discount program to try to build alliances in the region. So in that sense, while Chavez has carried that further, it is an entirely new thing.
Nick Kozlov, there, you have been critical of Chavez's foreign policy, though not necessarily from the standpoint of Washington.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, if the stakes on the domestic level are very high in this election, as we've discussed, I mean, in foreign policy, the geopolitical stakes are going to be nothing short of tectonic. Let's first talk about, say, Cuba. Capriles has said that the whole Cuban doctor program is going to be, quote unquote, under review. Well, I'm not necessarily such a huge fan of the Castro brothers, but I don't think that it would be such a great thing to withdraw tens of thousands of Cuban doctors which have benefited the Venezuelan poor. In other respects, I've been critical, as you say, of Chavez's foreign policy, not necessarily his engagement with other leftist Latin American countries, but with throwbacks like Belarus and Iran. And actually, I think this has opened up an unfortunate opening for Capriles, who has criticized Chavez and has said that if he's elected, he would totally change Venezuela's orientation towards Belarus, Russia, and some of these politically backward countries. And so I think that's been, in my personal view, quite a political miscalculation for Chavez, and he's opened himself up to criticism from Capriles.
Mark Weisbrot, there, you mentioned the U.S. Is there any sense that the U.S. is looking, well, can we take it for granted that the U.S. is looking with some concern at another Chavez victory? We had Paul Ryan, the Republican vice presidential candidate, talk about how Romney would get tough with Venezuela if he was elected. But what role do you think the U.S. is playing, or how are they looking at this right now, do you think?
Well, they don't want him. They've tried to get rid of him. I mean, they backed a military coup back in 2002. They've poured tens of millions of dollars, and still pouring millions of dollars into opposition groups in Venezuela. We don't even, I mean, that's what we have on the record, you know, from USAID and NED. We don't know how much.
Endowment for Democracy.
Yeah, we don't know how much.
Actually, I have a Freedom of Information Act request in, but I haven't heard yet.
Good luck with that. I think the
average, where the money's coming from. But anyway,
they've processed one about every 160 days.
Well, I won't hold my breath.
But so yeah. But I think what really is the thing that saves Venezuela from having to have really more destabilization from the United States is having these elections in the same year as the U.S. presidency. Like back in 2004, when there was the recall referendum, for example, you know, there was a large part of not only the Venezuelan right wing, but the U.S. right wing, which was very much represented in the Bush administration, that really wanted to not recognize the referendum results. And they had fake exit polls, and they had academic papers, and they had all this thing, wild conspiracy theories, which were very influential in Venezuela. I mean, the opposition boycotted the congressional elections in 2005, saying that the whole thing was stolen. And you see a little bit of that now.
We are, actually. More and more reports are beginning to come out then suggesting that the election will be stolen, that the Electoral Council is completely biased. But then we had this rather interesting comment from Jimmy Carter just a few days ago. Here's what he had to say about the Venezuelan electoral system.
But I think that the elections in Venezuela, although some people have criticized the result, which is Hugo Chavez having won, there's no doubt in our mind, having monitored very closely the election process, that he won fairly and squarely. As a matter of fact, of the 92 elections that we've monitored, I would say that the election process in Venezuela is the best in the world. They have a very wonderful voting system where you go in and you touch the screen and vote the way you want to, and instantly that touch screen result is recorded and can be transmitted electronically into the central counting headquarters, but it also prints out a paper ballot. And when you get through voting, you can not only have voted electronically, but you can look at the paper ballot and make sure that's the way that you wanted to vote. Then you put the paper ballot in a box, and you can go back and check the results later on if there's any doubt about it.
Nonetheless, Professor Hellinger, we are getting more and more reports in the media about the potential for a stolen election. We have an interesting article by Patrick Duddy, the former U.S. ambassador to Venezuela for the Council for Foreign Relations, talking about, well, muttering, I suppose, about contingency planning for violence after the election and so forth. There are lots of rumors, again, about people not respecting the results. Is there any truth to that, do you think?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think not that is not, I don't think there's much truth to the idea that the election is going to be fraudulent. I think there's a lot of truth that there are elements in the opposition that are preparing to try to delegitimize the election. And I'm sure that there are many forces, especially in the Romney camp, and probably some in the Obama camp as well, that would like to delegitimize them. I think there's, it's kind of interesting to think what happens if Capriles were to win. The next day he wakes up with Chavez as the leader of the opposition, probably in the streets, and the National Assembly under the control of the Chavez party for at least another 2 years. So there's going to be a lot of conflict there. And if Chavez wins, there are going to be elements of the opposition that think, oh my goodness, we just lost our last chance. Chavez will be there, health permitting, for a long time. So I think there's, I'm worried less about the election. I don't think there'll be fraud. I don't think the army, which is committed to the Bolivarian Constitution, would permit it. And I don't think there's much on the record that suggests that Chavez would try to defy the CNE, in which he is well represented, and try to steal the election or deny the results. The Electoral Commission, that's correct.
It does, though, Mark Weisbrot, bring up that issue of how the elections are being reported, particularly in the American media. I mean, Chavez is called a dictator pretty routinely in the New York Times, or Dan Rather, the notable anchorman here in the US, calls him that all the time. Also, on how the economy and Chavez's economic stewardship is discussed is quite interesting. And you've just come out with a report at the Center of Economic and Policy Research, which has asked if Venezuela's economic policy is sustainable. These are the findings, correct me if I get any of this wrong. After a collapse in oil prices, the country's economy went into recession between the first quarter of 2009 and the second quarter of 2010. The recovery was robust, though, you find, and by 2011 the economy had grown by 4.2%. It grew by 5.6% in the first half of 2012. And your report suggests the economy will continue to grow at a similar or higher pace for many years, partly due to the country's relatively low debt burden. In 2011, it was 45.5% of GDP. That's, if you were to compare that to the European Union, the EU has a debt of about 82.5% of GDP. Also, the economy has a sizable trade surplus, you argue. The country has significant oil reserves, which, assuming political stability is maintained, will bring in a significant income through exports. And yet, Mark Weisbrot, the latest Morgan Stanley report says this: Venezuela could default on its debt early as the second half of 2013 if President Chavez wins re-election next month and fails to shore up the oil-producing nation's, quote, increasingly fragile balance sheet. That's Morgan Stanley, clearly in September. I mean, how do you reconcile those two positions then?
Well, for 13 years, all of the business press, almost all the business press, has been saying that the Venezuelan economy was going to collapse. And the IMF, for example, during the recovery after the oil strike, underestimated economic growth by enormous margins, 10 percentage points, 6 percentage points annually. And they've always been saying this. They have all these disaster scenarios, and they've never come true. I mean, the first 4 years of the Chavez regime was very bad economically because he didn't have control over the oil company, and the people that were running it, the national oil company, PDVSA, were trying to overthrow the government. They literally had a strategy of military overthrow, according to the opposition itself. And so that was a bad period. But once the government got control of oil, you had very steady and very rapid recovery, again defying all the predictions from 2002 to 2008. The economy basically doubled in size from the bottom to the top. And then you had a recession in 2009 with the world recession, and then you had recovery in mid-2010. So I think there's really nothing to these theories. I mean, the government has the ability, has a low, as you mentioned, a low level of debt. It has a big trade surplus. It has enough reserves. There really, there are a lot of distortions and imbalances.
Do you think this analysis is partly because many in the business press simply don't get it, don't understand that social spending as a valuable tool, they're simply saying, well, according to their, in their monetarist paradigm, perhaps this should be a disaster. I mean, might that be it then? I don't know.
They don't understand a lot of things. Inflation, for sure, they don't understand. I mean, inflation now, for the last 3 months, has been 13.7%, which is the lowest it's been in 4 years. And that has happened while the economy has accelerating growth. So clearly that goes against all of their theories that, the inflation in Venezuela is due to government spending or expansion of the money supply, the other things. They don't understand exchange rate. I mean, there's a lot of misunderstanding, but there's also a lot of wishful thinking. I mean, they all want to see, everybody who's writing about Venezuela in this country wants to see the economy collapse.
Well, we're going to leave it there, I'm afraid, but we will definitely be revisiting this after the election when we get the results. But thank you, Nicholas Kozlov, Daniel Hellinger, and Mark Weisbrot. And that's it from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at InsideStory@aljazeera.net.